Doctor Who. So many stories, so many characters, so many writers. Over the years, many different writers have contributed to the rich tapestry of the show in a variety of ways, with some creating a lasting legacy that has influenced others and positively changed the direction of Doctor Who itself. But who is the greatest Doctor Who writer of them all? Furthermore, how do you define a great writer? Could it be Terry Nation for creating the Doctor's most famous adversary, the Daleks? Terence Dicks, who offered so much variety and also helped shape the stories of others as a script editor and author of many Doctor Who novels? Maybe Russell T Davies for resurrecting the show and his ability to create believable and relatable characters amidst the universe of science fiction? Or Stephen Moffat for his twisting story arcs and the ability to tap into the most basic primal fears. Or maybe you think it's a writer who's had major success outside of Doctor Who, such as Douglas Adams, Richard Curtis, or Neil Gaiman. All of the aforementioned, as well as others, are brilliant writers who have all left their mark on Doctor Who. In my opinion, though, there is one man who stands head and shoulders above all other writers throughout Doctor Who's history. A writer who ticks all the boxes of what defines greatness in Doctor Who storytelling. That man, none other than Robert Holmes. And in this video, I'm going to tell you exactly why. Firstly, let's find out a bit more about the man himself. Born on the 2nd of April 1926 in Tring, Hertfordshire, Robert Holmes held a variety of jobs before finding his feet as a writer for television. In 1944, at the age of 18, he joined the army and fought in Burma and rapidly became the youngest commissioned officer in the British Army during the Second World War. After the war ended, Holmes then joined the Metropolitan Police. It was here that Holmes discovered his love for writing when he was giving evidence in court and watching the frantic nature of journalists who were reporting on the cases. Teaching himself shorthand in his spare time, Holmes left the police and embarked on a career in journalism, working on regional and national newspapers. He also began submitting short stories to magazines in the late 1950s, and by 1957 he got his break in television writing for the medical series Emergency Ward 10. Into the 1960s, and Holmes would carry on writing for various series on television in either soap or crime genres. But in 1965, having been inspired by Nigel Neal's Quatermass series, he decided to venture into writing for science fiction. One of his failed attempts was a submission to the BBC for a science fiction serial known as The Space Trap, which was rejected. However, the head of drama serials wrote to Robert Holmes, suggesting he might have more luck submitting his ideas to the Doctor Who production office. A meeting with then script editor Donald Tosh seemingly turned out to be promising, but he soon left the show and Holmes' idea was shelved as he carried on writing for other shows. 3 years later, and Holmes once again tried his luck resubmitting his story proposal, which by chance got picked up this time by the production team, when another story fell through and the rescheduling other stories opened up a potential slot. Robert Holmes' debut contribution to Doctor Who became The Crotons, which was first broadcast on the 28th of December 1968, and told the basic story of a race known as the Gonds, who were enslaved by the aforementioned alien antagonists. The story was regarded as a general success by the production team, and when another proposed story for Season 6 fell through, he was called upon again to submit another, which turned out to be The Space Pirate. Admittedly, these two stories showcase very little of what Holmes would become synonymous with through his time writing for Doctor Who. It was during this time he formed a friendship with script editor Terence Dicks, who towards the end of Season 6 got promoted to senior script editor. With Patrick Troughton leaving Doctor Who in 1969, John Pertwee took the mantle of the Third Doctor during a period when the show would undergo one of its biggest transformations as it entered the 1970s and made the move from black and white to colour. For the Third Doctor's debut, Dicks needed a strong, impacting, yet basic storyline to set off his new era of Doctor Who on the right foot. He turned once more to Robert Holmes, who took the basis from a script he had worked on 5 years earlier to write what would become Spearhead from Space. A significant story not just for Doctor Who and the dawn of the Third Doctor, but also for Robert Holmes, as Spearhead from Space would be the first story he lays down some of the themes that he would become synonymous with in future stories. In this case, themes and elements relating to horror. The story revolves around a group of aliens known as the Nestines landing on Earth and making an attempt to invade the planet through their ability to control plastics with their mannequin-looking autons. With the use of the autons, Holmes created one of Doctor Who's most iconic scenes, in which they came alive and broke out shop windows, massacring the general public. This scene keys in with something Doctor Who does brilliantly to keep the audience on edge, by making something everyday and normal in something threatening and scary. In this case, mannequins, With Spearhead from Space, Holmes created a basic narrative that allows the new setup of the Third Doctor, the introduction of Liz Shaw, and the permanent establishment of UNIT, but in a seemingly Hitchcockian way, fills the space with suspense and jump scares, making Spearhead from Space memorable and iconic. Such was the success of Spearhead from Space that the production team of producer Barry Letts and script editor Terence Dicks came back to Robert Holmes once more to repeat the same formula for the debut story of Season 8. A simplistic story containing a basic narrative that allows space for an opportunity for the debut of a new character, in this case, the Master. Holmes took the basic plot outline of Spearhead from Space and applied it to make the sequel Terror of the Autons. The straightforward, repeated themes used in Terror of Autons provides a gentle background to allow the introduction of the Master, as well as the debut of Joe Grant. Once again, Holmes uses the spaces in the narrative to reach back into those horror elements, and here we not only get the familiar-looking Autons, but then Autons disguised as policemen, plastic daffodils with the ability to suffocate people, and even killer toy dolls. Holmes had by now developed a narrative structure for Doctor Who that allowed for a straightforward, non-complicated storylines containing scenes and plot devices that had the ability to keep audience both on the edge and behind the sofa. This also allowed the antagonists featuring these stories to become more memorable and iconic by being part of the iconic scenes that Holmes crafted in his script. Although Holmes' next two stories, Carnival of Monsters and The Time Warrior, deviate from this winning formula, he still sticks to straightforward storytelling to allow the ability for characters, in particular new ones, to breathe and develop, in particular with the Drashigs, Sontarans, Sarah Jane Smith, and even delving into Time Lord folklore with the mention of the Doctor's home planet now being known as Gallifrey. However, Holmes wouldn't permanently stray from his horror themes, and in 1974 he replaced Terence Dicks as script editor to work alongside 30-year-old producer Philip Hinchcliffe, who between them would arguably create Doctor Who's most successful period. At the same time, they saw the advent of the debut of the Fourth Doctor, now played by Tom Baker, in a similar vein to how their predecessors handled the debut of the Third Doctor. Holmes and Hinchcliffe took the opportunity to change the direction of Doctor Who by taking it away from the earthbound setups that formed the backdrop of the Third Doctor era, and this time back into space and various points in time. The horror and macabre elements be cranked up to new levels, and Holmes himself became more involved with the handling of scripts, perhaps more than any of those who had been script editor before him, and still contributing the stories of his own. The Fourth Doctor's debut story, Robot, which was written by Holmes' friend and predecessor Terence Dicks, was basically a hangover from the Third Doctor era, and designed to embed the characteristics of the Fourth Doctor. The next story, however, The Ark in Space, which was written by Holmes himself, that he had adapted from a basic idea from John Le Carre, took ideological science fiction elements into outer space, with the insect-like Wirren using humans as breeding ground to populate in a narrative that became reminiscent of the film Alien, which was released 4 years later. Holmes would also take on the scripts of other writers to a new level with extensive rewrites to align the stories within the themes that he and Hinchcliffe had set out for their interpretation of Doctor Who. This was perhaps best exemplified in Season 13, when they took the premise of Lewis Greifer's story and developed it into Pyramids of Mars under the pseudonym of Stephen Harris, and once more with Terence Dicks' premise, which was rewritten into The Brain of Morbius under the pseudonym of Robin Bland. Whilst rewrites by script editors weren't a new thing, it had never perhaps been done to the level that Robert Holmes exerted. By now, he seemingly became an auteur in Doctor Who with his script writing skills, and the concepts he delivered back in 1970 related to basic narrative and scare tactics towards the audience had not diminished. To add to this, various nods were made to Hollywood films in the 1930s, 40s and 50s that would form a backdrop to many of the stories under the stewardship of Holmes and Hinchcliffe. Terror of the Zygons took elements from Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Planet of Evil took elements from Forbidden Planet and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Seeds of Doom borrowed from Day of the Triffids, and the towns of Wen Chiang took inspiration from the Fu Manchu and Sherlock Holmes stories. Although Holmes didn't write all of these stories, it became clear that the writers had to produce something that fitted within his horror-style manifesto, even if Holmes himself had to do the rewrites. It might be dismissive to say that the methods applied under Robert Holmes' stewardship as script editor might borderline plagiarism rather than originality. But story writing as a creative form itself does that by taking inspiration from previously written stories to the point of when boiling stories down to their most basic narrative framework, you have to ask, how many original stories are there? Despite the borrowing of plot elements and motifs from horrors and thrillers of both film and literature, What was put on screen as an end product was undeniably Doctor Who, and as much as Holmes had borrowed themes from other narratives, there was extensive work done to enrich the history of the show itself. Whilst Robert Holmes acted as script editor, the show explored the origins of the Daleks and their creator Davros, regenesis of the Daleks, and continued the exploration of Gallifrey and the culture of the Time Lords, which was deeply explored in The Deadly Assassin, both of which provided a lasting legacy on the show's history. Good stories always need good characters, in particular the antagonists. Having previously mentioned, Holmes introduced us to the Nestines, Autons and Centaurans, as well as playing a hand in introducing us to the Master, but he created many other memorable original villains. And in the realms of horror and suspense, Holmes would often craft his villains as something they are not initially perceived to be. Sutekh from Pyramids of Mars was worshipped as an Egyptian god, and reality was the last of the powerful alien race, the Osirans. Magnus Greel, the criminal who travelled back in time to the 19th century and allowed his followers to believe he was a Chinese god called Wen Chiang, with his cyborg killer Mr. Sin posing as a ventriloquist doll. This deception makes the villain more memorable by giving them a false aura of evil, whilst keeping their weaknesses hidden, which the Doctor would eventually go on to expose in defeating them. All of this, coupled with Tom Baker's alien-like eccentric approach, provided the audience with something familiar in regards to the inspirations, but also something new that brought Doctor Who to an all-new level of peak popularity, with continual high ratings. Despite the audience satisfaction and acclaim, the ideologies Holmes had applied to Doctor Who narrative weren't without critics, in particular Mary Whitehouse, who strongly objected to the levels of violence and scares that the show was exhibiting. In 1977, Philip Hinchcliffe was replaced by Graham Williams as producer, who was instructed by the BBC to bring about a more family-friendly tone to the show and bring down the levels of violence and scares. This felt like a natural end of the line for Robert Holmes as his time as script editor. However, he would carry on part way into season 15, when he would then hand over the script editing reins to Anthony Reed. Although Robert Holmes' time as a script editor had come to an end, he was far from finished, and while Doctor Who was moving on from elements of horrors and scares, Holmes still managed to find a place with some of his writing strengths, in particular that art of character design and satire. Straight after finishing as script editor, Holmes provided a story to the production team that was inspired by his annoyance of his tax bill. This became The Sunmakers, which was a far cry from the violence and horror that he had provided for the last 7 years for Doctor Who, and slotting in perfectly with this new approach of a more family-friendly show. But this wasn't exactly a new approach for Holmes, but rather one he'd taken a back seat over the years, and you could argue that the previous Holmes submissions, such as Carnival of Monsters and The Deadly Assassin, satirised modern-day politics to an extent. As previously discussed, character design was another one of Robert Holmes' strengths, and he had shown his hand in the development of antagonists. But Holmes also had a fondness of creating double acts, in particular with protagonists who appeared as guest characters, with the most famous example being that of Jago and Lightfoot in the Towns of Wen Chiang, who ultimately went on to have their own audio drama series. Holmes would use this method once again with the Key to Time season opener, The Rebos Operation, by creating the lovable rogue duo of Gowan and Unstoff. As for the story itself, the production team looked to Holmes to provide a simplistic story again that allowed the establishment of the story arc that covered the Key to Time series, as well as characters such as Romana, the White Guardian, and the premise of the then unseen Black Guardian. By now, this was common practice for Robert Holmes, but where in the past he filled the narrative with suspense and horror, he instead fills it with interesting larger-than-life characters such as the previously mentioned Garon and Unstoff, the main antagonist Graf Vindicay and his faithful head guard Sholak, and even the minor character Binro, who, as the audience, you instantly become drawn to. All this, in the midst of a narrative of conning tyrants and obtaining the segment of the Key to Time, shows how versatile Robert Holmes was as a writer. Robert Holmes serves up another offering to the Key to Time with the penultimate story, The Power of Kroll, which came about in a method different to how Holmes provided stories in the past. Normally, the story that Holmes would submit would be his own original idea, and would be written to leave spaces for the longer narrative involvement as the request of the production team. However, The Power of Kroll came about when the production team required Holmes wrote a story that was to feature the largest monster that had featured in Doctor Who so far. On top of the requirement of fitting into the larger story arc for the overall season, The Power of Kroll falls short of Robert Holmes' usual high standards, and it would be his last contribution for the show for nearly 6 years, having been continually involved with the show either as a writer or a script editor for the past 11. The remainder of the Fourth Doctor era became more light-hearted and comedy-like, and didn't seem like an environment that Holmes' writing techniques would thrive in. In 1980, John Nathan Turner took over as producer and revamped the show both in front and behind the camera, as Tom Baker handed over Doctor duties to Fifth Doctor actor Peter Davison. On top of Nathan Turner's revamping came a fondness of him wanting to bring in new writers to the show, and for a while it felt like Robert Holmes' association with Doctor Who was over, as he went back to writing for other shows such as Blake 7 and even adapting his own miniseries The Nightmare Man in 1981. When Doctor Who celebrated its 20th anniversary in 1983, John Nathan Turner pushed for a special one-off story. Wanting to delve into the show's past, he initially reached out to Robert Holmes to write a special story based on a framework set out by himself and script editor Eric Saywood. Despite the dissatisfaction from his previous work The Power of Kroll, due to being written under a proposal from the production team, Holmes took up the invitation. However, after the rejection of his first proposal, he dropped out, and Terence Dicks took on the job and provided us with the 5 Doctors. However, Holmes becoming reacquainted with Doctor Who led him to establishing a friendship with Eric Saywood, who from his own writings had very much been influenced by Holmes' work on Doctor Who, and he was encouraged to submit a script for season 21. By now, Doctor Who was reflecting the change in style that was occurring during the 1980s on television, with more adult themes and a return to violence, and this seemed the perfect environment for Holmes to provide a suitable story in fitting with both his more macabre narratives and engaging characters. The end product was the Fifth Doctor swan song, The Caves of Androzani, which involved gun runners, smugglers, private armies, ruthless businessmen, and a mad scientist all fighting over the prolonging substance Spectrox. Holmes paints a scenario full of bleakness and full of unlikable characters who are full of corruption and greed. This simultaneously fits perfect into the Fifth Doctor era, for which Holmes had never written for, as well as setting a marker for the Sixth Doctor era, whilst also keeping within the wider TV medium during the 1980s, which was leaning towards being more edgy and radical, showing that Robert Holmes seemingly had his finger on the pulse with the feel of the era. Despite these seemingly new approaches to writing, The Caves of Androzani is still a typical Robert Holmes story. The themes of the story seem to be reflective of greater world issues of corporate greed coupled with arms and drug dealings, which is fairly adult for Doctor Who, but he harks back to some of his ideas used from his script writing era, with the whole concept of Sharish Jack being reminiscent of the Phantom of the Opera as a disfigured character hiding in the shadowy depths. The end result could be argued as not only Robert Holmes' greatest story contribution to Doctor Who, but arguably one of, if not the best Doctor Who story of them all. Quite the achievement, considering he was writing for a Doctor that he had never written for before, as well as providing further development for the newly arrived companion of Perry. It shows that Holmes' passion and suitability for writing for Doctor Who was very easy for him to slot back into. Season 22 would see Robert Holmes come back once again, providing another story in The Two Doctors. It seemed by now that Holmes was more open to writing a story around a brief set by the production team, with the intended setting of being New Orleans, involving another incarnation of the Doctor with a companion, as well as the Sixth Doctor and Perry, as well as the antagonists being the Sontarans, which were also Holmes' own creation. In the end, the setting was switched to Seville in Spain, and the other incarnation of the Doctor ended up being the second, along with the companion Jamie. Despite Nathan Turner's required brief needing fulfillment, Holmes still found the opportunity to throw in some of his ideas, including an allegory of meat eating with the gruesome chef Shockeye, which was reflected from Robert Holmes being a vegetarian himself. After season 22, Doctor Who would go on what would become an 18-month-long hiatus, due to the criticism in perceived drop in quality of the show. When it returned, the proposed plan for season 23 was scrapped in favour of the season-long story arc The Trial of the Time Lord. The production team wanted to get the season off on the right footing, and once more Robert Holmes was leaned upon to write the opening 4 episodes of the season, which became the story known as The Mysterious Planet. Holmes would, as he ever done so many times in the past, provide a story with a simplistic narrative and enough gaps for the production team to include their overall story arc narrative. However, Doctor Who as a show was a different outfit to what Holmes was used to during the 1970s. It was no longer one of the BBC's go-to shows for Saturday night television. Tensions had developed between the production team duo John Nathan Turner and Eric Saywood, and to top it off, Holmes' own health was in decline. The end product sees Holmes hark back to the narrative ideas from his debut story The Crotons, in regards to an alien entity subjugating the inhabitants of a planet who are kept away from knowing the true intentions of the antagonists. Additionally, it also contains the engaging characters who also form the double act, with the mercenaries Sabalon, Glitz and Dibber. It's not known whether Robert Holmes fell back to this narrative idea due to his ill health or not, but the story was poorly received, as was the whole season in general, and Holmes became upset over BBC executive Jonathan Powell's criticism of his contribution. Nevertheless, Holmes, despite the criticisms and his own deteriorating health, agreed to write the finale of the season that had become known as The Ultimate Foe. With the first episode complete, Holmes set about the narrative framework for the final episode, but his failing health became too much to handle, and he was unable to finish the work, and unfortunately passed away in the May of 1986, 4 months before his final contributions were televised. His unfinished work was initially completed by script editor Eric Saywood, who stuck closely to Holmes's ideas. However, John Nathan Turner didn't approve of it, leading to Saywood walking out and the script eventually being rewritten by Pip and Jane Baker. Robert Holmes was associated with Doctor Who as either a writer or script editor for nearly 18 years, and despite writing material for other programmes, it is Doctor Who that he is best remembered for. During those years, he provided versatility in his story writing abilities by providing themes based on horror, suspense, violence, but also satire and character bonds, as well as taking inspiration from other material and warping it into something that would very much be Doctor Who. Also, he was the go-to writer to provide that basic narrative, yet entertaining story, to usher in some of the vital periods of the show's history, and leaving plenty of development for overarching narrative ideas. When the show was at its peak, Robert Holmes was there churning out or improving stories that have been regarded as some of the best of the classic era, and when the show found itself short on ideas or at its lowest ebb, Holmes was there to provide a story. The fact he wrote for the show all the way up to his death clearly shows his passion and willingness to help Doctor Who succeed, and it was clearly the show he felt he could make the biggest impression on. Although he did write for other shows, the volume of work he contributed towards Doctor Who has resulted in him being best associated with the show. Had Robert Holmes had more success beyond Doctor Who, there would be no doubt he would have earned the rightful recognition as being one of British television's greatest ever writers. Going back to Doctor Who though, I asked the question earlier as to what defines a great writer for the show. Very few writers have operated successfully both as a writer through an individual story and as a script editor to the levels that was achieved by Robert Holmes. His stories were often simple yet with intriguing narrative ideas, and in turn these would be filled with iconic scenes such as the Autons massacring the general public, the Doctor surviving in the Matrix on Gallifrey, or being chased by giant mutant rats in the sewers of London. Going even further to top this off, he would fill his stories with engaging characters that were rich with backstories, allowing the audience to either empathise or hate, coupled with dialogue that was either witty, inventive, or both, whether it be Goth, Jago and Lightfoot, Lee Sen Chang, Garen, Sharish Jack, Shockeye, or Glitz. The list would go on. Many Doctor Who writers provide intriguing narratives, iconic scenes, or memorable characters, but rarely at the same time, and not to the level of Robert Holmes, who often, regardless of the Doctor or era, repeated this winning formula that defines an excellent Doctor Who story time and time again, which is why it is no surprise his stories are seen as some of the greatest in the show's history. Even to this day, his legacy lives on with his ideologies and writing style, opening avenues allowing writers to carry on the inventiveness of Doctor Who to this day. And that is perhaps the greatest attribute of anyone who creates something that engages many, that influence on others, and the standard that they set. But maybe you think differently. Maybe you have your own favourite writer for Doctor Who. If so, let me know who your choice is. In the meantime, if you want to find out more about Robert Holmes' work, then I suggest you take a look at this video here. For now, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.